At my ex-wife's funeral, my son ordered me out while preaching legacy and respect, and the room nodded like jurors as policy later rebranded my erasure as orderly continuity. That morning, I tightened a leaking sprinkler and polished a flip-open watch someone quietly repaired. Small rituals beside grocery envelopes that kept a retired sergeant upright when voices turned cold. They called favoritism tradition and humiliation respect for legacy. While family seat cards vanished into a pocket, the elevator served the right surnames, and emails trimmed my name to overflow. So I answered with law, receipts, and the chair the will granted, vowing to protect workers, secure wages and safety, and reclaim dignity by using power to serve, not preen. When power finally meets proof, who deserves the seat, and whose story should carry the room? However, I am Aaron Hale, 65, retired logistics sergeant, steady hands, steadier habits. And the day starts with lists, because lists never raise their voice. But the apartment stays quiet except for the soft tick of my pocket watch, so I polish the crystal, test the hinge, and slide it beside the grocery envelope. However, the brass lid still shows old initials and a faint stubborn date. And I brew coffee, sweep crumbs, tighten a cabinet screw, and trust the ritual. But the phone shivers across the counter, and discipline lets the machine answer. So a calm woman names a chapel, a time, and papers downtown afterward. However, I play the message twice, print the hour in block numbers, and breathe. And a second message from the director stresses seating, parking, and a family row to avoid. But thanks for understanding means stay quiet, which is currency in rooms like that. So I iron my one good shirt, press clean lines, and square my stance. However, the folded flag case goes back on the shelf, and my shoulders settle, and the neighbor thumps the wall about sprinklers while I add wrench to the list. But I decide the joint gets fixed tonight, because decisions calm louder storms. So I step into the stairwell. Detergent and lemon trail up from the laundry. However, the Honda turns over easy, faithful as a dog that never strays. And I tap the watch at the light, letting its beat steady my breathing. But my chest tightens passing the diner near the tracks, where memory wastes energy. So I count utility poles until the chapel spire cuts the sky like a blade. However, I park far off by a buckled drain and choose the side entrance, and a black suit nods without meeting my eyes, which is an art. But lilies load the lobby air, while the memory board sells vacations I only funded. So I take the last row, knees close to hymn books, eyes on the program card. However, whispers track me like gnats. I let seconds pass and keep posture square, and a familiar cologne moves toward the front pew while I study the fine print. But a seat card, marked family, vanishes into an usher's pocket with practiced efficiency. So I pretend not to see, because pretending can be mercy on a Sunday. However, the group thread on my phone confirms rides and head counts without my name. And plausible kindness hides exclusion when you trim a list cleanly and smile. But the organ swells, the eulogy praises relentlessness, and grief arranges itself for cameras. So I fold the program as the last chord fades and the aisle opens thinly. However, gentle bodies redirect me toward the wall, and I wait for the wave to pass. And a well-meaning woman mentions overflow seating downtown later, voice crisp as laminate. But coordination prefers simplicity, really means fewer moving parts, preferably me. So sunlight bleaches the morning's edges as I cross the circle toward my car. However, I wind the watch 3 turns, reset breathing, and accept the next test. And downtown glass cools the street while a text repeats the separate elevator note. But thanks again arrives with stay invisible tucked underneath like a folded napkin. So I park behind the courthouse, lock twice, and place the program under the watch. However, the city office corridor hushes the block, and signs ask for patience, and the air tastes like toner and cardboard while doors whisper shut behind me. But I have not spoken the decision aloud because timing remains a weapon. So I keep it sheathed, press the call button, and watch the numbers crawl. However, the elevator opens into carpet that drinks footsteps and feeds whispers. And the receptionist lifts a finger toward a glass door, marked with a balanced name. But my neck warms under the collar, as two figures rise from low chairs. So the younger man adjusts his cuff and lets disdain move first across his face. However, I recognize my son by the jaw he got from his grandfather's picture, and the woman beside him scans me the way people scan expired parking meters. But she squeezes his wrist, then smiles toward the receptionist, then erases the smile. So he positions himself between me and the door, like a human stanchion. However, my breath shortens, then steadies by habit as I smooth the folder. And I announce my appointment time without adding any explanation that begs approval. But he answers instead, suggesting the meeting has limited capacity and stricter protocols today. So his tone implies practicality, while his body declares a border I should respect. However, the receptionist repeats my name slowly, then confirms the calendar with a nod. And the woman introduces herself as his fiancée, using a voice crisp as laminate. But she promises to streamline everything if I wait downstairs for the summary packet. So her eyes deliver a verdict before any facts exist, which is efficient. However, I keep my hands still because stillness helps more than clever words here. And a door opens, and a polished man invites us inward with measured warmth. But my son walks first, claiming the center of the corridor with confident strides. So I follow at an even distance, counting steps to ease the heat rising. However, framed certificates line the wall like stations in a procession toward judgment. And the conference room glows under a long fixture that flattens every expression. But 4 chairs stand arranged on one side, while one waits alone, opposite. So my son guides the extra chair 2 inches farther from the table edge. However, he angles it subtly, making a triangle where a line should be. And the fiancé chooses the end seat, opening a notebook already ruled in sections. But the attorney clears his throat and sets a leather folio at dead center, so he reviews the agenda and emphasizes that all named parties must remain present. However, my son interrupts with a palm lifted, insisting on propriety and logistics first, and his words describe respect while his posture advertises removal by any means necessary. But the attorney's gaze does not move. He repeats the attendance requirement without embroidery. So a small color drains from my son's cheeks before anger climbs to replace it. However, I take the opposite chair and align it with the table's clean edge. And my fingers rest flat because hands tell stories when mouths should stay closed. But the fiancée reviews a printed schedule and underlines a time block twice. So she murmurs something about overflow rooms and security, careful to sound helpful. However, the attorney thanks her, then states the rule again in a thinner register. And I write the time on my legal pad and circle it once. But my jaw sets when my son scrapes his chair to narrow the aisle. So the room hears metal on carpet, a sound designed to announce territory. However, the attorney slides a glass of water toward me without breaking eye contact. And I drink once, because a dry throat betrays a person's footing at speed. But my neck still flushes as the air conditioning lifts hair along my forearms. So I count 4 breaths, then align my pen with the pad's left margin. However, the attorney asks us to confirm relationships for the record with full names, and I provide mine with a steady tone and a measured exhale afterward. But my son states his in clipped syllables, then adds an unnecessary qualifier about status. So the fiancée adds her connection with a glance that invites shared superiority. However, I note the phrasing on my pad because phrasing reveals intent faster than facts. And the attorney begins formal preliminaries, explaining sequence, witnesses, and document storage. But my son interrupts again, suggesting a delay until certain verifications can be assembled. So the attorney answers that verifications already exist and are part of the file. However, my breath tightens when my son turns to me without turning his head, and his shoulder tilts to block more light from my side of the table. But I rest my palm on the folder and keep the paper square with the wood. So the fiancé whispers to him that optics matter more than petty victories right now. However, the whisper is loud enough to recruit the room without admitting the recruitment. And the attorney proceeds, listing letters, exhibits, and the time the notary will arrive. But my pulse steadies as familiar structure puts rails under the afternoon, So I switch modes from submission to documentation, because structure rewards the patient. However, I record each step in tidy columns, leaving gaps for later references. And I limit my sentences to facts, because opinions rarely age well on paper. But my son asks the attorney to confirm the seating arrangement recorded in previous meetings. So the attorney mentions only one prior arrangement, which did not include today's attendance. However, my son stretches his fingers and locks his thumbs like he is warming up. And the gesture reminds me of field drills, where bravado expired before sweat. But I let that memory pass and keep my eyes level with the table. So the attorney reviews confidentiality, then asks for acknowledgement with a simple nod. However, my nod arrives clean, while my son's arrives late and heavy, and the fiancé nods like a camera might be hiding somewhere under the lights. But the attorney announces a brief delay, while the clerk retrieves an envelope downstairs. So my son rises and angles toward the door, clearly planning a hallway sidebar. However, he stops in front of me and hovers just inside courteous distance, and he speaks softly enough to keep the attorney from claiming an intervention. But his meaning lands bluntly. He believes I should step out for efficiency, so I hold his gaze, then decline without words by not moving an inch. However, his nostrils flare, and the fiancé presses 2 fingers into his sleeve, and she mutters that escalation costs more than it pays inside controlled spaces. But he ignores the advice and taps a knuckle twice against the table. So the attorney returns just then, and the air clears like a window cracked. However, the clerk hands over the envelope and retreats with silent steps and lowered chin, and the attorney resumes, redirecting energy back to process and recorded order. But the interruption leaves a residue that tastes like copper behind the tongue. So I sip water again and feel my fingers steady exactly as trained. However, he asks us to verify contact information for follow-up and certified mail, and I provide mine. Then I request duplicate copies sent to a secure box. But the fiancé remarks that redundancy suggests distrust, which complicates professional relationships. So the attorney replies that redundancy prevents misunderstandings and protects all parties evenly. However, she smiles without warmth and marks a new box in her notes anyway. And I list the date by my request because dates calm disputes before they hatch. But my son leans back and crosses an ankle over his knee in triumph. So he believes posture can reverse rules already anchored by signatures and witnesses. However, the attorney sets the envelope down and rests his hands on the folio, and he mentions timelines, probate windows, and a final confirmation of duty to attend. But my son exhales through his nose and stares at the ceiling's silent strip lights. So the ceiling gives nothing back, because ceilings never vote in family wars. However, I review my notes and underline the phrase duty to attend carefully, and my ribs loosen as logic builds a platform higher than humiliation. But a text buzzes on my phone from a number labeled coordinator. So the message reminds everyone of reception staging down the block and parking validation. However, it also includes a highlighted line about family-only access through the main elevator, and the phrase floats like bait, cast toward me from an upper balcony. But I answer with a brief thank you and request clarity on named parties present, so I document that request on paper, then confirm that the message was delivered. However, the coordinator replies with a neutral acknowledgement and a generic statement on policy, and I file that under evasive because precision refuses to show its face today. But my son whispers that policy exists to protect legacy from embarrassment and confusion. So his voice calls me embarrassment without spending the word where anyone could challenge it. However, my breath shortens again, then lengthens as discipline takes the wheel back, and I rotate my shoulders once to loosen the tightness across the blades. But the attorney asks if we need a 5-minute pause before proceeding further. So my son declines on everyone's behalf, as if power were a chair he owns. However, I accept the pause and stand because standing resets blood and perspective. And I step to the window and watch traffic sift through a green light, but the reflection shows my son behind me, jaw clenched, eyes bright with certainty. So I study my face instead and decide it can carry what comes next. However, I return to the chair and reopen the folder to my checklist, and I add 3 boxes labeled seating, elevator, and distribution order for later review. But the attorney scans our posture and resumes with renewed control of the room. So he confirms that the reading will proceed despite discomfort, comments, or social friction. However, my son's foot starts a restless rhythm that stirs the carpet fibers, and the fiancée reaches down and stills it with 2 fingers and a smile. But her eyes ask him to play the long game behind closed doors. So the long game becomes my focus because short games already failed me today. However, I write 1 sentence at the bottom of the page with care, and the sentence states that boundaries require records or they fade during arguments. But the pen lifts, and I know this page will guide the coming hours, so the first clash ends without theatrics, leaving marks nobody else will see. However, the harm sits real and measurable, like a bruise under a sleeve, and resentment hardens into a tool that cuts cleaner than outrage ever could. But tools demand operators, not victims, which is a role I can manage. So I cap the pen, square the folder, and slow my breathing to count. However, the attorney prepares the next envelope while the room waits for gravity, and gravity arrives in the form of a thought that does not blink. But I do not speak it aloud, because words scatter too easily here. So the decision settles, quiet and heavy, and refuses to leave with the air. However, the attorney's pause stretches long enough to expose everyone's instincts, and I use the gap to reframe the day as tasks instead of torment. So I open the folder, sort pages by timestamp, and start measuring boundaries, and I list what I will accept, what I will decline, and what changes today, marking columns for requests, outcomes, and proof. However, my jaw hardens remembering the chapel seat card pocketed by staff. I note chapel seating removed, time unknown, witness unclear, and add request lobby cameras tomorrow. So structure returns, and the clerk confirms a notary is en route. But I photograph each page before anything changes and flag the coordinator's messages as potential exhibits, capturing subject lines and times. So the pad grows weighty, with fact instead of grievance. However, the attorney stacks envelopes by priority. My son rolls his shoulders like he owns the ring. But I tighten patience, ask once for copies, then let silence work. So breath settles into a 4-count learned on long marches, while resentment powers tasks that protect dignity. And I rewrite today's date, underline twice, then box things I can control before sundown. So I call the utility and pause the landscaping charge. A confirmation number arrives and goes on the pad, and I stop the storage payment pending inventory. The prorated credit lands. However, these small corrections feel like sandbags before a storm, so I shift to proof, and I text a neighbor for photos from last month's handyman visit. Images return showing my signature beside the repaired back gate lock. So I file them under maintenance covered by me, stamped and verified, then staple confirmations to notes as the attorney clears his throat. However, the fiancé watches, rearranging pens like chess pieces, hunting loose ends, and the attorney pauses again. We have 5 minutes, so I request a copier. And the receptionist sends me down the corridor where machines hum behind glass. But I keep it brief. Copy pages, add a numbered cover sheet, seal a manila envelope to my box, film the seal with the timestamp, and request certified mail with return receipt. So the clerk stamps, hands me a tracker, and the parcel vanishes. However, the pocket watch sits heavy in my palm. The lid flips open, and a faint engraving winks inside the rim. So I tilt the brass. 2 initials not mine, a date between last winter's fall and spring thaw, matching a jeweler's repair stamp I once saw. And someone arranged that service, quietly. The watch shifts from keepsake to message. You were not forgotten. So I record it. Engraving present, correlate with ticket, request records if needed, and pocket the brass. However, the midpoint pivots here, not with shouting, but with proof of quiet intention. And my steps back to the room feel measured. But the fiancé reads the change and shifts to friendliness. My son frames events like a press release that crops me out. So I counter with dates, times, confirmations, and the attorney notes my certified receipt as the notary enters, while my son's foot vibrates the table. However, nostalgia for old bleachers fades. Duty retakes the wheel. And when the fiancé asks to streamline signatures, the attorney declines and quotes procedure. So I underline procedure protects everyone and refuse a breakout room that would sideline me, citing duty to attend with a finger on the line. The attorney confirms, and the suggestion dies. However, my son pivots to accounts. The attorney answers that nothing moves until filings and clocks complete, so I write clocks control transfer, not desire, and box it, and I avoid escalation, let the watch warm my wrist, and log that landscaping, storage, and small charges are paused, but I add car title inquiry and insurance audit. Schedule calls for tomorrow at 9. So the notary stamps, the attorney requests identification, the scanner records without drama. However, when the fiancée mentions optics, I thank her without granting purchase and write optics irrelevant where statute governs process. And the meeting resumes. Small victories stack. But a text from the coordinator requests reception confirmation. I reply, I will not attend and request written acknowledgement, screenshot the confirmed line, and label it boundary enacted with timestamp. So suspicion finds no purchase. However, the assistant delivers a folder labeled Exhibits. We share the index. A sealed note is listed for later, and I chart the next friction point and manage energy instead of chasing winds. But the attorney calls a brief pause for a clerical question. My son and the fiancé step out. So I draft a written request for chapel lobby footage, copy it clean, and set a reminder to file it first thing tomorrow. And the utility confirms the hold order. I circle the green check. However, footsteps return. The attorney announces the next envelope, and my son's gaze sharpens as if willpower can edit signatures already dry. But documentation has opened a door nobody can lock. They will push harder now. So I rest my hands flat, keep breathing invisible, accept the cost, and prepare for the blow that always follows progress. However, the attorney sets the next envelope at center and studies our faces, and the room cools by a degree, as if the fixture dimmed a fraction. But my hands unclench on their own, ready for whatever the paper orders. So I straighten the pad and align my pen with the ruled margin. However, my son sits taller, claiming victory in advance like a seasoned closer, and his fiancée tips her chin, already rehearsing relief for the cameras that appear. But the attorney opens the envelope with a careful thumb and a clean breath, so he describes the scope first, placing assets into categories that calm accountants. However, real estate sits in one column, liquid holdings move to a second, and he lists obligations with dates that can be verified without anyone's opinion. But he pauses before the third page, then continues with language that carries consequences. So the first bequest covers a residence with furnishings and a timeline for transfer. However, my son nods on cue, confident that the script finally remembers the heir, and the attorney notes a cash amount that would fund several careful years, but he adds conditions that bind employment to patients and forbid early liquidation. So a chair leg ticks against the carpet as pride meets its first edge. However, the room holds steady, while the attorney's cadence never rises above, measured. And breath falls into rhythm again, a metronome borrowed from strict mornings. But my son's knuckles pale where his grip tightens under the polished table. So the fiancé smooths a page and whispers that conditions show trust in long-term growth. However, the attorney does not comment. He simply turns to the next section, and the paper rustles like dry leaves as a season changes without permission. But his voice grows even more formal, rounding each clause as if it might bruise. So he reaches the paragraph that names controlling interest and appoints a chair by title. However, the title links to a percentage that tilts the floor a few degrees, and my name appears there, balanced against numbers that would scare a reckless man. But the numbers do not move, they anchor themselves under signatures already notarized. So silence arrives like weather, cold and total, before anyone breathes again. However, I keep my gaze level because victory faces ruin faster when it gawks. And my pulse steadies as if a long slope finally bottomed into solid ground. But my son's mouth opens, then closes, then opens again without sound escaping. So the fiancé lifts a hand that asks for decorum while telegraphing calculation. However, the attorney continues, outlining board procedures and interim protections against hostile reshuffling. And he cites competency evaluations dated and signed by professionals outside family influence. But the evidence arrives like freight, heavy and unstoppable across a steel bridge. So I let each axle roll over me and rattle loose the doubt. However, I do not celebrate. Celebration invites spectacle and inflames weak corners. And I accept losses already booked because clean wins always require paid receipts. But my voice, when asked to acknowledge receipt, stays steady and smaller than pride. So the attorney records the acknowledgement and places a copy near my elbow. However, my son finally finds sound and casts it across the room, like shrapnel. And he frames the reading as a procedural error that demands immediate suspension. But the attorney declines without heat and cites statute until the words build a wall. So the fiancé switches fronts and argues optics and reputational harm in whispered phrases. However, I refuse the bait and keep my palms flat where everyone can see. And my breath draws evenly while the tremor that haunted my thumb leaves. But my son stands, sits, then leans forward until the chair protests every inch. So the attorney reminds everyone that tone counts in rooms with certified pens. However, the reminder lands. My son pulls back, jaw locked, eyes bright and furious. And the room inhales together, then holds that breath where moments decide their shape. But I choose tasks over triumph because tasks feed outcomes, while triumph feeds enemies. So I request copies routed to my secure box and digital vault tonight. However, I ask politely, log the request and underline the time on paper, and the attorney nods and assigns a clerk with a checklist clipped to her sleeve. But my son pivots to staff morale and claims leadership requires continuity unfettered by sentiment. So the fiancé nods along, offering phrases that shine like coins under harsh lights. However, the attorney replies that continuity follows documents, not moods, in this jurisdiction. And I write that sentence down because good sentences become guardrails when nights grow long. But the air thickens again when my son's eyes settle on me like crosshairs. So I meet them without flinching and let the seconds count without mercy. However, I remember a different hallway where he once tied his shoelaces badly. And I remember steadying his shoulder before he ran toward his first small victory. But memory cannot testify here. Only dates and signatures can stand beside me now. So I let the tenderness pass and keep dignity where everyone can read it. However, the fiancé proposes a temporary governance council that excludes named parties for tranquility. And tranquility sounds lovely until you notice who benefits from the hush most. But the attorney declines again, then places a finger on the appointment paragraph calmly. So the paragraph explains succession as clearly as a street sign at noon. However, backlash rides in on the next breath, fast and rough and entirely predictable. And my son announces intentions to challenge everything with the full catalog of objections. But his words turn the air brittle. Even the fixture seems to hum a note higher. So I refuse spectacle. I hold posture and pour water like this is merely logistics. However, the weight of the room scoots 3 inches toward me and stays there. And I accept the weight without complaint, then slide it into process and proof. But acceptance does not mean surrender. It means strategy wins over appetite today. So the attorney asks for signatures acknowledging receipt of specific sections and exhibits. However, my son signs with a stroke that might cut the papers back. And I sign with a stroke that treats paper like a partner in truth. But the fiancée signs last, and her pen hesitates as if gauging cameras unseen. So the notary stamps again, and the sound marks another inch we will not lose. However, my phone vibrates once with a message labeled Coordinator regarding reception adjustments. And I ignore it because reception belongs to people who trade casseroles for favor. But the attorney suggests a 10-minute recess to restore temperature and reconsider posture. So we agree by silence, which is the only agreement available here today. However, my son leaves first, shoulders wide, stride sharp, eyes refusing any target. And the fiancé follows, speaking softly into her phone with efficient concern. But I remain in the chair and let the quiet seat itself beside me. So my fingers uncurl completely, and the last tremor leaves like a respectful guest. However, the clerk asks whether I need anything, and I ask for a fresh pad, and she returns quickly with a pad that promises clean columns and clean days. But I write nothing for a minute, and stare where the light hits varnish, so the varnish reflects a ceiling grid that looks like order pretending to be permanent. However, I know permanence lives only in choices you repeat daily without applause, and I decide to trim obligations that never fed anyone but pride. But I list 3 items I will cancel tonight before I sleep. So these cancellations become my first act of stewardship rather than revenge. However, the corridor outside carries footsteps that announce a return to confrontation, and the result arrives on schedule, full of energy, low on patience, hungry for noise. But noise cannot alter ink. It only scatters concentration for a few expensive minutes. So the attorney reopens the session and stacks the signed pages neatly together. However, my son chooses silence now, a colder weapon than any shouted threat. And he stares through me as if I were a smudge on a window. But the absence of sound carves deeper than the loudest verdict handed down. So that silence becomes the late blow, landing where old hopes still kept a room. However, I absorb it, accept the loss, and let the ache lodge without drama. And I protect routines by checking the time for my evening walk mentally. But I also secure essentials by confirming a meeting with the current operations lead. So the attorney agrees to schedule introductions tomorrow morning with agendas attached. However, I request a board briefing packet sent to my box before sunrise, and I add 1 line about workplace badges and access lists remaining unchanged. But the fiancé suggests a cooling-off period that pauses access for public harmony. So the attorney denies the pause because harmony cannot supersede explicit appointments. However, she nods, as if she planned to lose this round to win another one. And I prepare for that next round by noting names I have not yet learned. But the clock on the wall keeps climbing, reminding everyone that daylight dwindles. So the attorney concludes the reading and closes the folio with practiced finality. However, the air does not relax. Consequences rarely let a room relax quickly, and my son waits for me to stand first, testing for deference or retreat. But I take my time and gather pages with care that honors the paper. So he exits eventually, dismissing me with the back of a shoulder, blade raised. However, I allow that exit to happen without a word to follow it, and the fiancé lingers a second, then leaves a business card that smells like graphite. But I leave the card on the table because not every offer requires storage. So the attorney thanks me in a tone that offers neither pity nor praise. However, I ask him to email the competency certifications and the chain of custody log, and he agrees, adding that the sealed letter remains for the appropriate moment. But I nod once and accept that moment belongs to a different temperature entirely. So we shake hands, brief and firm, and I step back into the corridor's hum. However, the building's elevator dings like a metronome that dislikes excessive triumph, and the lobby's lilies still press their perfume into the throat like stubborn honey. But the sidewalk's heat climbs through soles as I cross toward the driveway's shade. So valets jog and open doors for people who practice grief like choreography. However, I wait beside a pillar and let the afternoon grind into evening. And the SUV with tinted glass slides forward, indifferent as a rolling door. But my son sits behind that tint, staring straight ahead, as if air were enemy. So the fiancée speaks to him without moving her mouth, and the driver pulls away. However, the silence they leave behind feels heavier than the curb's cracked concrete, and I swallow once and taste the metal of surrender I will not choose. But I do not chase them. Hunting peace never works in public driveways. So I turn toward the street and feel the heat flicker off the hooded engines. However, a notification blinks from the bank about unusual activity and temporary holds, and my chest tightens, then loosens as I read the details carefully line by line. But the hold touches only a small account and expires tonight without intervention. So I file the message in a folder named Friction and keep walking past it. However, I text the attorney's clerk and confirm the document courier route and timing, and she replies with a precise window and a tracker number that comforts. But I also cancel the reception attendance with a second, final confirmation request. So the coordinator replies confirmed again, and the thread ends without any smiley faces. However, the street noise smooths into a steady river that carries me a block, and a diner's window shows my reflection seated in the old back booth years ago. But I keep moving because nostalgia spends energy I need for the next hour. So I choose stillness while walking, letting breath settle into a pace that forgives. However, I set a reminder to fix the neighbor's sprinkler joint before nightfall, and the ordinariness of that task saves me from the gravity of larger titles. But gravity drifts back when I reach the parking lot behind the courthouse. So the Honda waits where I left it, patient and unoffended by luxury badges. However, I rest my hands on the roof and count to 4 before unlocking. And a robin hops over a white line as if policing the stall. But I do not laugh because laughter feels like armor too thin for this moment. So I sit, adjust the mirror, and watch my face settle into a workable calm. However, the late blow blooms again when I realize he never once looked back. And that absence sinks deeper than any curse, finding a space under the ribs. But I accept that space and mark it as an injury I will not reopen. So I start the car and let the fan push warm air across my face. However, the phone vibrates with an email from the attorney marked personal reading, and the subject line mentions a sealed message scheduled for tomorrow morning, but the body offers to deliver it sooner if logistics permit quiet and clarity. So a lever appears, thin as wire, lifting something heavier than paper inside me. However, I use the thin lever before it cools and vanishes. And I call the attorney's clerk, requesting the personal reading moved to tonight. But I specify a quiet room, full attendance, and copies routed immediately afterward. So the reply arrives with a precise time, a door code, and witnesses. However, I shower, change shirts, and pack my notes into a rigid folder, and breath deepens as posture squares, steps landing even and sure across tile. But the late sun slants along the city office corridor like a metronome. So I arrive early, confirm the room, and test the pen on margins. However, the clerk checks IDs and logs arrivals with tidy strokes and neutral eyes, and my son walks in first, shoulders wide, confidence leaking through an expensive watch. But his fiancée hovers close, offering efficiency that usually means subtraction by prettier words. So the attorney enters last, carrying a sealed envelope and a measured calm. However, the room knows the center of gravity before anyone sits in place. And I lay my folder flat, then square a stack of certified receipts. But I focus on behaviors tonight, not people, because precision trims waste cleanly. So I ask for process on record, agenda posted, and time boxed clearly. However, the attorney opens the envelope after confirming readiness with a simple nod, and breath thickens as paper brushes paper, a sound older than arguments. But words arrive like rain on tin, steady, plain, and unable to flatter. So the letter records motives, choices, and instructions no rumor can counterfeit now. However, she names character as the hinge, not power or appetite or speed, and she frames wealth as a tool, not a trophy for public theater. But she also places responsibility in my hands and measures it by service. So she asks me to steady the enterprise and protect workers before optics. However, she asks him to build something real without shortcuts or borrowed glow. And she writes that inheritance cannot repair a soul trained to demand applause. But the letter also softens, acknowledging failures and the cost of unbalanced devotion. So the truth surfaces inside sentences that never raise their voice or tremble. However, the attorney logs completion and sets the pages within reach for copies. And stillness follows, heavy and clarifying, like air after a hard summer storm. But I do not chase victory. I turn toward tasks that follow truth. So I present maintenance receipts, bank confirmations, and pausing orders aligned to dates. However, I slide evidence to center, then list decisions enacted to protect transitions, and I state terms in clean language that targets conduct without labeling people. But I add that staff access remains unchanged, payroll protected, and benefits preserved. So governance follows documents, not tempers, and implementation begins tomorrow at 9. However, my son finally speaks, questioning competency, timing, and the fairness of distribution. And the attorney answers with evaluations, signatures, and the statute that refuses louder interpretations. But the fiancé shifts angles, suggesting mediation for optics and relief for public nerves. So the attorney replies that policy already provides a road, and we are on it. However, I accept fallout while I refuse theater, and my chest opens easier, and I deliver the line clean and quiet, placed where leverage matters most. I fund with receipts. I expect a seat at the table, but I leave it there, letting the sentence ring without extra nails or ribbons. So the room resets around process as if someone leveled the floor beneath us. However, I request an operations briefing at dawn and a board packet before sunrise, and I ask for a facilities tour by week's end, starting with the warehouse. But I also schedule a listening hour with staff who never see boardrooms. So my son watches, jaw tight, realizing control no longer answers his hand signals. However, he pivots to the house and the cash conditions that chafe ambition. And I confirm he keeps both when employment terms are honored without loopholes. But I add boundaries that protect assets from unscheduled extraction during transition. So legal phrasing binds behavior, not feelings, because feelings turn overnight, without notice. However, he leans forward, breath sharp, testing for weakness behind my steady posture, and I hold the gaze calmly until the tremor in his fingers quiets. But the fiancé suggests a pause until a communications plan minimizes reputational turbulence. So I agree to a brief draft window, paired with a hard release deadline tomorrow. However, the draft will name safeguards, stability, and a focus on ordinary work, and it will not host a victory lap, apology tour, or curated myth-making. But the attorney nods because clarity shortens meetings and protects everyone's future sleep. So we sign acknowledgments, each stamp sounding like a door sealing pressure tight. However, I add 2 more actions before the ink dries and the night hardens, and I authorize a compliance audit on vendor ties and inside favors, timeline attached. But I also greenlight a hardship fund for workers facing immediate medical bills. So courage must show receipts too, not just talk in warm phrases for cameras. However, my son laughs without sound, then asks about titles, badges, and keys. And I state the badges remain, the titles stand, and the keys rotate nightly. But I commit to shadow days before setting any new hand on a wheel. So humility and control share a bench because each protects the other from error. However, the fiancé glances at the clock, calculating press cycles and board whispers, and she floats the idea of a joint appearance to signal clean cooperation. But I answer that cooperation begins with scheduled work, not staged smiles under lights. So the attorney records that phrasing, which will matter when narratives start to wander. However, a courier arrives for the letter's certified copies and the chain of custody log, and the clerk scans the barcodes while I initial the ledger with deliberate strokes. But my son's patience cracks around the edges, showing heat without spilling flame. So he demands a private sidebar the process does not require or reward now. However, the attorney declines gently and invites written concerns routed through counsel tomorrow. And I back that offer, because paper disciplines, tempers, and protects everyone's memory. But the fiancé thanks the room and frames the outcome as orderly and professional. So her tone irons wrinkles that still ripple under expensive fabric and bright eyes. However, the letter's last paragraph still works on me, like salt and mercy. And I steady myself with breathing, taught by long mornings rather than old wars. But I keep that history silent because history should not collect favors here. So I focus on workers, contracts, and the first 90 days recorded on paper. However, I request weekly checkpoints with operations and monthly reviews with finance. And I ask HR to draft a procedure protecting whistleblowers from retaliation immediately. But the attorney smiles a millimeter, hearing a plan that lives beyond this room. So we close the folder, lock the envelope, and log the final signature time. However, my son lingers, radiating grievance that seeks an audience and a stage. And I resist the invitation, because anger without aim eats its owner first. But I do not offer comfort either. Comfort would confuse the boundary I drew. So I gather my receipts and stand, posture balanced, voice unnecessary and present. However, he says he will contest, and the fiancé promises efficient preparation overnight. And I answer that challenges belong to courts, not hallways, and I welcome daylight. But I keep my tone even because even tones outlast fireworks and smoke. So the attorney escorts us to the door and returns keys to their hooks. However, the corridor outside hums with late custodial carts and careful, ordinary industry. And that industry steadies me more than any triumph could pretend to manage. But the fiancé calls after me, proposing a calendar for the communications draft before midnight, so I agree to a time block that respects staff sleep and newsroom cycles. However, I refuse any glossy language that pretends pain never happened to anyone. And she nods, recalculates, and notes the constraint with a small professional smile. But my son steps closer, breath hot, expecting me to blink or kneel or wobble. So I let the moment pass across my face and continue walking toward elevators. However, the clerk hurries after me and hands over 2 labeled document tubes, and the labels match my requests from earlier, including the audit template and hotline draft. But I thank her and add both items to the top of tomorrow's list. So the list clicks into place like gears that prefer duty to drama. However, the elevator doors open, then close, then open again for late arrivals. And a custodian backs in with a cart and nods like we share a secret. But the secret is simple. Work done well beats noise served hot every time. So the doors hush shut, and I breathe easier as the car drifts downward. However, the ground floor smells like copy paper, floor cleaner, and tired lilies, and night has settled over glass like a calm seen from deep water. But my spine stays straight, because courage is a posture before it becomes a habit. So I step into the driveway's dim and feel heat lifting off the concrete. However, my phone buzzes with confirmations stacking into a neat digital column, and each entry marks a problem contained, not a person defeated for sport. But a final message arrives from the operations lead, accepting the dawn briefing gratefully. So a small weight lifts, and my lungs feel wider than the corridor upstairs. However, I pause by the curb and let the calm finish rearranging my insides. And the city sounds skitter across asphalt as the last office lights click. But the conflict core has settled into process that will hold through morning. So I head for the car, steps even and sure, hands relaxed and ready. However, my son stands by the SUV, eyes rimmed with a mean, sleepless shine. And he says he will never accept this map, no matter how lawful. But I answer with a nod that neither taunts nor yields nor invites negotiation. So he turns away, and the fiancée studies me like a puzzle with missing edges. However, she finally offers a small, careful goodbye that sounds like strategy, not peace. And I let it pass because strategy can keep the peace until hearts learn patience. But justice tonight was simple. Truth stood up, proof walked in, and weight lifted. So the room reset to level, and the future will run on scheduled rails. However, a small aftermatter trembles at the doorway in the shape of family, and it waits for tomorrow's light to decide whether it enters or keeps walking. However, morning arrives clear and cool, and the city feels newly ordinary, and I start with routines that carry weight without drama, brewed coffee and clean counters. But I also open the folder, check the dawn briefing, and confirm the agenda. So the operations lead meets me on the warehouse floor, boots squeaking on paint. However, we walk aisles slowly, speaking in facts and times and needed guardrails, and I note small hazards, loose pallets, a short ladder, and one tired bulb. But I praise a foreman's checklist that catches what pride usually leaves for luck. So the first hour closes with targets, owners, and dates that do not slip. However, finance follows, tight and transparent, and numbers sit where signatures already settled. And HR brings the hotline draft. We fold retaliation language into policy like steel. But I keep meetings short because shorter talks respect work more than showy speeches. So the morning ends with a calendar that honors labor and bans theater. However, I step outside and let the sunlight wash off fluorescent residue gently, and I drive home without checking shadows in the mirror or stories on glass. But the driveway greets me with quiet gravel, and the porch boards hold steady. So I unlock the door, set the folder down, and breathe in a cleaner room. However, a small envelope waits under the mat, edges dusted with pollen and grit, and a jeweler's logo sits in the corner, neat and slightly raised with ink. But inside, a receipt names my watch and lists a spring, a hinge, and polish. So the card on file shows initials that belong to my son, not me. However, the work date lands between last winter's fall and the first thaw exactly. And a short line thanks the customer for returning a family timepiece to service. But the line carries more weight than words meant to fill a margin politely. So I sit on the porch step and let the truth settle where pride thins. However, I press the watch's lid and feel the hinge swing clean and certain, and the brass warms against my palm like a small stove built for patience. But I text the attorney a brief note confirming the morning's outcomes and next steps. So I also send the operations lead a thank you and a list of follow-ups. However, quiet returns, and with it a choice that refuses anyone else's fingerprints. And I sweep the porch slowly, moving leaves into a tidy pile near the rail. But gravel crunches, and a familiar SUV idles at the curb longer than usual. So a door shuts, and footsteps slow, then stop at the bottom stair in place. However, I stand but keep one hand on the post, because balance matters today. And my son looks older around the eyes, anger traded for something tight and uncertain. But he says he will meet the employment terms and hold the house responsibly. So I answer that records will track both, and help exists where effort arrives first. However, I add that today can be quieter if we fix one thing together. And I point to the sprinkler control by the porch where a joint still weeps. But he nods once, and he follows me to the toolbox without ceremony or signals. So I hand him the wrench, and he kneels, testing the nut with steady pressure. However, the threads complain, then seat, then hold water like a promise kept grudgingly. And we both watch the dial settle at 0 as the small drip stops. But I feel breath ease, and my shoulders lower without asking permission from history. So I fetch a rag. He wipes the housing. I coil the hose and step back. However, the quiet that follows feels earned, not the brittle hush after performance. And I tell him the jeweler sent a receipt naming his card and date. But I keep my tone even, and I add that the watch works beautifully now. So he studies the porch boards, and he says the hinge looked ready to fail. However, he says he handled the repair because the sight of that crack hurt. And he adds that knowing mattered more than being thanked in a lobby later. But I'd tuck those words away, because gratitude should live in deeds, not dramatic vows. So I hold out the watch and ask him to wind it 3 turns carefully. However, he does, and the second hand steadies as if it never doubted us. And he returns it to my palm with a nod that fits the morning's scale. But I do not hand him absolution. I hand him specific times and places instead. So I set a weekly check-in on Sundays at 5, porch or phone if needed. However, I ask for 30 minutes focused on work, plans, and concrete decisions only. And I require no surprises, no public tests, and no whispered barriers in hallways. But I promise fair hearing, clear records, and help that does not humiliate anyone. So he agrees with a breath that shakes, then steadies, and his posture lifts an inch. However, we define a 3-month window where behavior proves itself better than promises ever do. And we mark the terms on paper because paper outlives mood, fear, and convenient edits. But he asks if this changes the company's direction, and I answer with basics only. So I state that operations will protect wages, safety, and schedules, not appetites for spotlight. However, I add that mentoring exists for people who build, not people who harvest. And he nods again, then says he will work under structure without shortcuts or back doors. But I resist the urge to soften further because softness without structure breaks under weight. So I pick up the broom, and he gathers leaves. We finish the porch together quietly. However, the neighbor across the fence pretends to weed while counting seconds between our movements. And I wave once, and she pretends not to see, which suits everyone just fine. But the sun climbs, and the boards warm, and the air finds an easier rhythm. So my son checks his watch, mentions a staff call, and steps toward the walkway carefully. However, he stops, asks if I need anything later, and waits for a calendar. And I tell him to text before 6, otherwise tomorrow holds better space for talk. But he accepts that boundary and walks to the SUV without dragging the moment longer. So the engine starts, and the vehicle rolls away without the old flare or glare. However, the porch keeps the shape of 2 sets of footprints in wood dust. And I take a photo of the fixed joint and the folded invoice for files. But I also send a short message to the operations lead about the afternoon cadence. So the reply returns fast, confirming tasks and asking for a 5-minute end-of-day debrief. However, I agree, then silence the phone and lean back against the post comfortably. And the watch ticks on my wrist like a small vow, faithful and unafraid. But I decide to visit the warehouse grill next month for a simple cookout, thanks. So burgers, water, and pie will do. Cameras can stay home for one afternoon. However, I text HR to schedule listening hours in person before that cookout begins. And I ask finance to publish a plain language sheet that explains protections and timelines. But I keep the tone of every message steady, not triumphant or martyr bright or brittle. So the porch breeze moves the edge of the doormat, and a robin hops nearby. However, I polish the watch's crystal with my thumb and let memory pass without sting. And I allow one measured hope to stand, small and strong, in the doorway's light. But forgiveness remains conditional, tethered to calendars, receipts, and the quiet courage of follow-through. So gratitude becomes daily work, not a speech. Human value outranks wealth and theater.